Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello, this is Tim O'Hara. I'm hosting this event from SMB. I see we have a number of attendees from different industries, including public accounting, management consulting, healthcare, retail, business services, and manufacturing. So I hope you'll find this a good investment of your time. I wanted to just share a little bit. Over the past 9 months, when I've been meeting with business owners and some of our partners, I've been hearing some information about privacy and GDPR it was frankly scaring me a little bit. And when I shared this with our leadership team, we decided to partner with Leaseweb on this event. They have a little bit more of a global reach, and we have a little bit more of a local reach. And what we're seeing is many folks are not aware of their obligations and risks under the GDPR, and others that we had talked to had somewhat gotten inconsistent or bad advice, and we just sort of wanted to do this as a service to you. We appreciate your investment in time and ask you to approach this with an open mind. And we feel like when you do this, you'll be better able to see the applicability of GDPR to your business, be better prepared to maintain your business reputation through avoiding adverse publicity and potential significant financial penalties that could hurt your financial position in your company. Some of those, the maximum range in the 7-figure range. So they can be extensive. Also, another reason to look at this is similar legislation is under consideration in the United States at the federal level, and also more states here are increasing their privacy regulations. So this is another reason why you want to looking at this now is a good thing. But before we get into it, I have a little housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording and the slides from today's webinar will be emailed to everyone within about a day after today. Please submit questions via the text box. You can see it here on your right. And we will address all the ones we can. And any other unanswered questions will be answered post the webinar. We'll get in touch with you, but we will do the questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So a little bit about today's agenda. Leaseweb is going to share a little bit about their journey as a global company in establishing their global GDPR program, how they approached it globally and in the USA, and their certifications. SMB will share some real-world examples of how to manage risk as a small medium business in the United States with GDPR and privacy in terms of what information needs to be protected for what individuals and what processes you can put in place to better ensure compliance. So today's presenters, we have Jacqueline and Gizan from Leaseweb, and Galaxia and myself from SMB. What I'm going to do is, again, we're going to turn this over right now to Leaseweb. They're going to, again, go through the key elements of a GDPR program, key frameworks, standards, and measures, and conclusions and legal requirements for processing data under the GDPR.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everybody. This is Jacqueline. Jacqueline van der Werken is my name, and I'm the Global Group General Counsel for Leaseweb. We are very pleased to have you here as the audience today to learn more about GDPR, also for Leaseweb USA. And let me first give you a short business overview. Leaseweb headquarters are based in Europe, in the Netherlands, and we render services through our local companies independently in all regions. Leaseweb delivers, as a fact, infrastructure as a service. So Leaseweb is in fact a global hybrid cloud solutions provider with 20 years of international experience. So We embrace optimal security and support for our own network, but also, of course, for our customers. Leaseweb also delivers cybersecurity services and backup and disaster recovery services together, very important, with our GDPR-ready vendors and suppliers. Next slide, Tim, please. So that brings us to the heart of the webinar today. Now, about the GDPR, and you see the little blue European flag. In Europe, in fact, we had already the Privacy Directive from 1995. That already covered most of the requirements now as per the GDPR. So we are quite used to apply privacy protection globally. But under the old regime, it was a patchwork of differences in local implementation, even in Europe. So now this regulation is automatically and equally applicable with only minimal national variations in Europe, that's to say. So it gives us an upside because it gives me now uniform standards to roll out in Europe and also in the rest of the world. And in fact, if you see the name in the flag, the name should actually have been the General Personal Data Protection Regulation, since we learned today, and maybe you know, that it only concerns personal data, so identifiable to a person of a European resident. Now we move on to the logo that we have as Leaseweb in our GDPR-ready program. I'll teach you a little bit about the territory and the principles. So the GDPR territory is defined as all EU-based, so European-based residents that you deal with. So if you render services from outside Europe to European-based customers, the GDPR is equally applicable to you, even though you're in the US or other parts outside of Europe. Therefore, we rolled out our global GDPR program for Leaseweb to all our companies, including Leaseweb US. So privacy is really in our organization structure embedded. We call that entity split because our organization is quite independent locally. So we already had it in our DNA. And of course, our optimal focus on privacy security has always been there. So even though it's big work and it's for everybody involved really a job, we were lucky to be on the right path already. So that leads us to the green logo that you see. It's called CISP, and you can find this logo on our website for the GDPR certificate that we obtained globally. It's a global privacy code of conduct, and it's approved by the Working Group 29. And if you go into details of the European Union, you will find that the Working Group 29 is a combined panel of local authorities that will govern and are looking after the regulations. So you can find this on our website, and if you use the link, you can look up the public register of CISP, and you will find Leaseweb as a globally certified data services provider. It's called Cloud Infrastructure Services Providers of Europe. And now, of course, very important for Leaseweb USA is the Privacy Shield. Recently, Leaseweb USA obtained a US Privacy Shield certification from the International Trade Association. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Many companies have it nowadays in the US. And the privacy statement, the general conditions, also our data processing agreements and our security certifications have altogether resulted in this positive and important certificate. Actually, it ensures that data processing by Leaseweb USA meets all the standards of the GDPR. Tim, we can go to the next slide. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit of our program rollouts. So as you know, the GDPR applies to the European-based customers of Leaseweb USA with respect to their, if any, and their customers, if any, personal identifiable information. So it's really focused on personal information if that has been transferred. Now, here is a summary of what we have rolled out as a GDPR program for Leaseweb USA. and you can check it all on our website. First of all, our GDPR-ready privacy statements for all global entities and also specifically for Leaseweb USA Inc. are very easy to find on our website. If you become our customer and if you are based in Europe, we will provide you with GDPR-ready conditions or data processing agreements. And in using our services for European-based customers of Leaseweb USA, we ensure you a very high level of protection for data processing in non-EU countries like the USA. We do that through our US Privacy Shield and also on request through our standard contractual model clauses. If you have read more about this topic, it means that outside of Europe, we need a secure level of data processing. And that goes, if you're not in the US, through the standard contractual clauses that are issued by the European Union. That's a very handy and standard template that you can use. So next is that we are very proud that we can reference to our technical and organizational measures that we took, and that we acquired our GDPR certifications. In fact, we already had our technical certifications, but very, very important is that it secures also data privacy. And also we started to apply privacy by default and privacy by design in all our developments, tools and processes. What does it mean? Well, it actually means that all our positions in systems and processes by default are privacy secure. So it means that in our design of new tools, we only use the strict and needed minimum of personal data. And in addition, we have enhanced solutions for the data subjects involved to execute their right to be forgotten or your right of inquiry. And that applies to EU residents, in fact, if they are a customer of Leaseweb USA. So all requests may go through our US privacy Leaseweb email box, and you will be in a very convenient way supported with your rights. Then internally as a company, under the GDPR, there is the requirement to make up a personal data inventory. It's like an overview that you have to make for your own accountability company of all the processing activities in all the departments and every company that you have in your group. So it means that you have an overseeable sort of list what type of processing activities you execute. And finally, we enhanced our data procedure for breaches procedures to report if needed. Actually, that is currently available because in the EU, this process was already mandatory, but we updated them. And needless to say, really, so far, of course, Leaseweb USA had never anything like a data breach. So this was my introduction, and now Gizan of our global compliance team will continue with 2 more slides on the content.
Thank you, Jacqueline. As Jacqueline previously mentioned, technical and organizational security measures are a requirement under the GDPR. This measure requires organizations to ensure a high level of security when processing personal data, this in order to mitigate the risks. The requirement applies to both controller and processor, terms which I will explain later. Leaseweb as an IS provider already had technical and organizational measures in place prior to the GDPR, such as international security standards for use for protection of sensitive data, information security standards developed to enhance cardholder security, security standards for protection of health data. The following appropriate measures have been taken by Leaseweb in addition to the existing measures already set in place, as previously mentioned, the CISP certification and EU Privacy Shield. The CISP Data Protection Code of Conduct for ES providers, which provides a guide and verifies GDPR compliance. This is to ensure cloud customers that their cloud provider is using appropriate data protection standards. EU US Privacy Shield As a standard, EU does not allow the transfer of personal data of its citizens to a third country unless the third country is deemed to have adequate privacy protection. By obtaining an EU-US Privacy Shield certification, Leaseweb USA is considered to have adequate data protection and can therefore facilitate transfer of EU personal data. Lastly, a few standard privacy and security measures implemented globally to all our entities are a Dutch-based headquarters, limited access to only authorized personnel, encrypted communication and network segmentation, which is the physical and virtual segmentation of our network to primarily boost performance, but also improve security. Next slide, please. Thank you. What are the processing principles for EU-based data subjects? What is a data controller or data processor? A controller is a natural person or an organization that determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data. Leaseweb is in this context a data controller with respect to its own data, such as employee data. A processor is a natural person or an organization which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. Leaseweb is a data processor in relation to its customers. Leaseweb processes personal data on behalf of its customers. The processing of personal data by Leaseweb is covered in the general conditions, as the GDPR requires a contract or other legal act to process personal data. As previously stated, the EU-US Privacy Shield certification of Leaseweb USA is considered to have adequate data protection mechanisms, which permits processing of personal data outside of the EU. As conclusion, Leaseweb is legally permitted to process personal data under the GDPR. Processing of personal data is needed for the performance of a contract, when there is reasonable interest to do so, and when there is consent of the data subject. Consent is, for example, needed for direct marketing purposes. For more information and legal grounds for processing personal data, please visit our website. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for providing an excellent overview of the steps Leaseweb has taken to ensure its global compliance, and for an excellent summary of how GDPR can apply to different types of entities and situations. And for our participants, I know this information might seem like a lot and overwhelming. You can certainly see that there's a lot of preparation a global company must do to be compliant. Fortunately, most United States companies don't have to be as comprehensive, but there are some areas that may affect companies that are based here. I'd like to cover some of these areas and share a little bit how you can address them in terms of what data needs to be protected for what individuals, and some key processes you can put in place. And really, now, before we do that, I just want to say this content was assembled for educational purposes. We are not attorneys at SMB, and we don't play one on TV. So we just would like you to make sure that you seek the advice of counsel before you, to ensure that what you're doing will be compliant. And what I want to say is here, now when we're going through this, I want you to think about your business and a little ways, some things that I hear that were some common misconceptions. I talked about that as one of the drivers for us doing this. GDPR, May 25th, 2018 hit. I'm compliant. I'm done. I don't have to worry about it anymore. That's definitely not true. We heard that in what Leaseweb covered. It's an ongoing, continuous process that you have to have in place. we can outsource our responsibility. Well, certainly Leaseweb is, in themselves is a data processor, right? So they can provide services for you, and SMB, but you cannot outsource your responsibility under the law. You can certainly outsource the processing of activities, but thirdly, it only applies to client transactions in the European Union. So what I mean there is, again, as we talked about earlier, it's really about the subjects, the data subjects, wherever they are in the world. It's more about where their data is than about the presence of the entity itself. And lastly, it only applies to big businesses. I'm a small business. Nobody wants my data anyway. That's definitely not true. And we just want you to be sure that you're considering this when you're looking at your governance, risk and compliance planning in your company. So now we're going to go a little bit about the section agenda. Again, we're going to think about how I can manage risk, how you can manage risk better, what information is protected for what persons and what situations, and what processes apply. And so now I want you to think a little bit about your business. And this is what I call an information life cycle. And it basically starts with the development of your enhancements, your innovations, and your transformations in your business. And when you do that, how is data stored there? This is an area where I've seen a lot of companies not have their data properly encrypted and protected, is in their development or test environments. It's definitely something, if you're running test files and they have data that's covered under this regulation, it's definitely something you need to make sure those environments are consistent with what you're doing in production. When you capture and create information, so you're receiving data from places, you want to make sure that before you accept legal responsibility for it, if it comes in through your email platform or something is created, and that it's not, that again, there's proper levels of protection applied to that data, and it's also looked upon who's accessing it, who's sharing it over time, so that you can make sure that make sure that things are happening the way you expect. And then we go on from there. Even if you're analyzing data, maybe you're doing some marketing segmentation or some analytics, maybe some big data, and you're using a data warehouse or some other type of data repository. Make sure that those areas are also properly secured and protected. And then finally, go through your backup process, whether that's a premise backup or a cloud backup. Again, you need to that's another area where the data is replicated. You want to make sure that you have your protections there, and also on your physical files. And then finally, how you retain the data and purge it. You just want to think about that whole cycle as we go through some individual examples here, and that'll be a good way for you to model how this can apply to your business. But first, we're going to do a couple of polling questions, and our first question will be, which risk framework does your organization use? Are you using a cybersecurity risk framework today? So just go ahead and answer. These answers, they remain anonymous. We're just trying to get just some understanding a little bit more about the audience. Okay. Okay, and so what we're seeing here, okay, that's good. That's good. Okay. What I'm going to do now is this slide here it has a lot of information on it, and the key thing here is data subjects and personal data can be various things, and I gave some examples here. I just thought through some situations when I had discussions with clients and things that came up. So this is by no means exhaustive, but you can see it applies to a lot more than you might think. And I just want you to be aware of this, but rather than try to read that, we're going to go through a couple examples here. Okay, so the first one here is an online order. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this came about. So I was meeting with a major tourist attraction downtown, and I was talking about this as a potential risk to them, and they just didn't understand it. But when I looked, they had a room full of branded merchandise that they sell to people. And when I asked how much of it they sold, they sell quite a bit of it, and they not only sell it, you know, there or live, but they said they ship it to people all over the world, and they take web orders, and they track them on social media. So then I explained that this would be an example of a situation where GDPR would apply, and they should do some type of assessment, and then they better understood. Secondly, let's say I'm a business in the downtown Chicago, and I'm hosting, I'd say I'm in the Hancock building, one of the larger buildings in Chicago, and I lease my space from a management company, and that management company hires a professional security force to monitor physical security in the building. When I come in, they ask me for my government ID. They have video shooting as a visitor of me all the way everywhere I go. And they asked for my signature that by my government ID. Now there's three pieces of information that was on that list earlier that I had where the identity of the individual is possible. And since that information is stored and kept and retained for a certain amount of time, just going through that life cycle, you could see here that there could be some risk there. The next one is one that I've come across a couple of times where someone I talked to had an employee that was a joint citizen. So they were a citizen of a European Union company, and they were a citizen of a U.S. company. And this doesn't have to be an employee, but a person could be a dual citizen. And in that case, they are a member of the European Union, and if you're tracking sensitive data about them, you need to protect it appropriately. The last one is an area that we're kind of almost skimming the surface on in this, but it's third party. So imagine that you you hire a law firm for your business to consult with you on a personal injury matter of a citizen of Germany. You then should, under recommended practices, inquire as to how they protect that data of that person. In any third party that you engage with, even in the prior example where I talked about the physical security firm and the property management firm, all this stuff, as you can see, depending on how your business is structured and how you contract for your services, there can definitely be some risk here. And now that we've covered a little bit about managing risk and information, I want to go a little bit deeper into third-party risk. So basically, just a few things. Make sure you identify the parties especially ones that have considerable risk, that you do a lot of business with, or maybe where this kind of situation is more applicable. And like I said, be careful, because I generally find when we talk to clients about this, that there's more there than they've originally believed. Have a closed loop process in place for pre and post contract reward, and then execute the process and evaluate it consistently for improvement. You know, at least I would, at least, again, if we're using third parties that this applies to, get some type of attestation and evaluate that continuously, and you know, use that as part of your contractual language with your vendors and maybe even your clients, depending on the situation, and you know, make sure that you hold them accountable. This can also be applied to a situation where you might have independent agents that sell your products and services for you or represent you in different ways. So like I said, there's a lot to this, and it's just something, again, that if you have questions about, and when we're offering a free consultation, we'd be happy to talk through this in more detail with you. And again, so now we have our second poll question, which is, how have third parties been identified and evaluated for GDPR in your business? Okay. Okay, good. So we can, that's good. Okay, so, all right, sorry about that. Okay, so I just wanted to go through. So again, so now since we've now summarized a little bit about what GDPR is, what it applies to, secondarily, what information is important, and what are some of the situations where it applies. We'd like to share a little bit more about some processes you can put in place to ensure that you consistently execute well on this. And I'm going to turn it over to Galaxia here.
Great, thanks, Tim. I want to go. Thank you so much for the slide. Okay, so we talk about all the policies, procedures, and those things that you kind of need to be GDPR compliant. We're not really talking about what information do you have to give to the authorities. How are you going to give that information? So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the data breaches, the risks, when it happens, what do you need to do? So the first piece that we're going to discuss is research. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back one more, my fault. The first one is research. So we're going to talk about what the actual cyber criminal is looking for. They're looking for information to either make their way through and get some payments. For example, ransom is very on the rise. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's supposed to increase significantly over the next couple of years. They've already changed the way that they're trying to grab the information. So that's huge. So the cyber criminal is researching about your business. And what are they researching? Well, they're trying to find out who makes decisions. They're trying to find out who's in the accounting team, or maybe someone in sales that can get them a loop in, and maybe they can pretend to be a client. So they're doing all these very smart things to portray, to get information to eventually portray you. I don't know how many times our clients have come to me or come to my team and has said, hey, I got breached. There's emails going out asking for payment information. We get it too. We try to stop, we try to increase educating our clients to avoid them from getting breached, but that stuff happens. It's very hard to reduce that type of risk, but knowing what the cyber criminals are looking for is the first step. So let's talk about the stage attack. Go ahead, Tim. So a couple forms of the staging of the attack is really, how are they going to get that information? Well, obviously phishing is pretty much on the rise. There could be additional phone engineering, so someone calling up and saying, hey, I'm such and such customer, I need to know my account number so I can pay you guys, etc. They can do any of those things. It can also be through IM. So what's happening now is if you have a chat forum, let's say that someone wants to buy services from you, right? Sales entry forum, and you go through chat, they can say, oh, I was looking at this on your website, here's the link. You click on the link, you're infected. So they're trying to manipulate different ways of doing social engineering. And then obviously the whole infrastructure weakness is pretty popular now. I don't know how many of folks have not seen it on the news, but the whole VPN breaches that are happening on the routers, and these are pretty popular routers, high-level industry players within the network solutions division that are having weaknesses in their actual devices. So having the infrastructure weakness is huge. It has been less likely in the past for the infrastructure side of things. Commonly that has been increasing has been the social engineering, but I think at this point in time, a lot of the cyber criminals are hitting it from both sides because there's more innovation and tools that they are using, and this is a business for them, by the way. So they're optimizing their business by having software developed to have bots send full social engineering campaigns or send scripts to try to breach into your infrastructure. So it's just one person or a couple of people sitting behind a screen pressing a button, leaving it, and then getting information from your environment. So that's important to know what type of information, how they can get in, because the biggest thing that clients ask me is, well, how do I know when I'm attacked? Well, that's interesting. You're probably not going to know unless you have certain security measures in place, and we'll talk about them a little later. And the other thing is, well, I have internet slowness. Is that a sign of me being attacked? Well, again, yeah, maybe, because there could be some additional bandwidth going through your network to try to maybe breach a server, all those things. But you have to understand the certain forms of patterns within a cybersecurity attack to be able to stop it and track it. And to track it, you have to have solutions. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, Tim. Okay, so now they have access to the system, and so they want to be able to get as much data out as possible. So how do you know what data has actually left your environment and what data was affected, right? So they could be in a server, and typically what happens in this situation, and I've experienced this many times with clients, that they're in a server and the client says, oh, I know someone was in here, I've had a virus, it was ransomware, etc. I just did a restore, I'm okay. It's not always true, and we'll talk about why that's not true in a moment, but you have to understand, A, what data was taken, and B, who was affected. So I don't know if you guys have had any relevance in the media or not, but there was another big breach that has happened. Ironically, I got a notice yesterday because I have LifeLock that says, hey, by the way, here's 3 of your passwords that are registered to these systems, and you were part of this 13 million record breach. Great. That's exciting for me. So I have to go through and do my due diligence and clean up my files and records and make sure my credit report's good and all that regularly. So those things aren't fun. You have to be able to notify specific clients that have been a part of a breach. The blanket information is fine to a point, right? Letting everybody know, hey, we've been breached, here's what's going on if you were affected. But then eventually, if these things go to legal matters, there's going to be some data analysis that's going to want to know what information was exactly taken, and you're going to need to provide that information if you're a part of that cause. So that's one piece. So then the next slide for me, Tim. Okay, so the data was accessed and the hacker has it. So the real question is, so everybody thinks the following, and I made this statement earlier. I've been breached, I'm resetting my passwords, I'm doing a restore, I should be okay, right? Yeah, that's only like one piece of the puzzle. There's a million other things that you have to do, which is why a lot of clients that have been breached that I've worked with in my career have worked with forensic companies to go through and do additional due diligence, who've worked with, even myself involved, being able to do additional research and help them build their security posture and reduce the risk of being attacked again, because there's a lot of backdoors, right? So if we're focusing on one server that the data was taken, let's say that ransomware is on a file server and has certain data. Well, that's fine. You can do a restore and all of that, but guess what? That server is on your network, and they got in your network. So what other environments in your network have a backdoor access now that you aren't aware of? which is why some security solutions are important to know where that cyber criminal got in, what other environments they touch, because they could come back later. I've had several clients I've worked with. School districts have been pretty popular with getting hit because of the phishing. But there's a school district I've worked with in the past that had 7 ransomware attacks in 4 months. And they did the whole system restore, reset passwords, but they never invested in security solutions to be able to fully track where that cyber criminal is going. So they had to do a full infrastructure rebuild, and it was pretty costly. So you don't want to get yourself into that stage because it does get a little bit on the high side. So we'll talk a little bit about solutions next. Go ahead, Tim. Okay, so in regards to a breach, the documentation of events is painful. You have to paint the picture with evidence. Typically what happens is there's a whole, it's just like if anybody's watched CSI or Criminal Minds, they do that whole investigation discussion, they do interviewing, they do pictures, documentation, they put the little pins on the board and try to pin the scenes together on what happened next and where is this person. So it's kind of the same thing except with the whole data side. So you want to be able to paint the picture, but you have to do it appropriately in the right steps, or you could affect the whole case. So just having proper protocol on, you're not going to want to do certain things like erase the system right away without data preservation. You're going to want to kind of have what that other environment looks like. So password reset globally is important. You have to do a log review. You need to do data preservation. You need to have system imaging. You can do a restore. Interviewing documentation you have to do as well. You have to review the policy and procedure, and you have to have the notification of the breach in process, right? So all of this is going on at the same time. Typically in this fashion, you're going to want to do the interviews, you're going to want to harden that server, make sure information is still not going to be exported. So all of this is happening simultaneously, which is why it's important that there is coordination going on when an event of a breach, so that steps are not overcrossed, right? So you're not going to want to do a system restore without preserving the data. That would be bad. And you sure are going to want to do a full clean house without having some documentation, maybe pictures if it was a physical intrusion, interviewing the right people, a part of maybe the potential attack. So you're going to want to have formal process, and our consulting services also help with that. So we want to be able to make sure that clients know what needs to happen next. And next slide, Tim. Okay, so I had mentioned a little bit about solutions, and it seems a lot, and it is a lot, because the reality is that without a proper security assessment, without someone going in and looking at your environment to figure out where you're at as far as your posture, it's hard to say these solutions work, right? Everybody has different regulations they have to follow. Everybody has different regulations they have to follow, and they have different policies and procedures that they have pertaining to their business. So not everybody's the same. So there's some things where I may recommend solutions to some clients and not to others because the dynamics of their business are different. The dynamics of their infrastructure are totally different. Virtual clients versus on-premise clients have 2 different types of solutions. They are not the same. They are similar as far as functionality and features, but I'm not going to be selling someone an on-premise security solution. I would be trying to get someone to have something in the cloud because it doesn't make much sense. They have different brains and different functionalities. So the high-level information about how to have some defense on a data breach, and this is typically solutions I recommend after security assessment. But like I said, security assessment's where it's all at, get you the baseline of where you need to be. So monitoring, user access control, infrastructure management, and security management. Now, monitoring is important. This is where you get to identify when you have a data breach, what information is coming out, what information coming in. You can also stop a breach with a different type of monitoring. So it could be device monitoring, could have firewall monitoring, switch monitoring, server monitoring, all of it on a security layer. And then user behavior monitoring. So being able to find abnormalities with users transferring files at weird times in the night or shouldn't have access to certain locations. You would never know until after a breach. This monitors that type of activity. User access control. This is all permissioning group management. If you don't have an access control solution like Active Directory or any of those things that some have in the cloud, you really should invest in that, because you're going to be able to control the type of access level your employees have in your environment. I work with a lot of small businesses as well. And they typically don't have stuff like that. They leverage Microsoft's Office 365, and they're just using their email, and they have those permissioning, and that's okay because they're mostly virtual. But there is cloud solutions that can help you authenticate being a virtual client. So there are certain things that you should have in place. Infrastructure management. I'd mentioned some of these things before, like doing a restore. Well, in order to do a restore, you have to have backup management, right? So making sure your backups are working and functional, right, and tested. So that's important. Patch management. If you have legacy equipment and it's no longer being patched, you are at risk. You have to do some additional system hardening to make sure that it is somewhat decent to not being exposed. I don't care if your firewall is great and working fantastic, because if everybody had an awesome firewall, we wouldn't have security breaches. There are many different vessels that cyber criminals can get in. So patch management is critical. A lot of attacks have happened because weak patching, or vendors of hardware not finding vulnerabilities before the hacker. So that's common. Hardware lifecycle management, I talked about legacy equipment. If there's not a reason for you to have legacy equipment, let's say that you don't have a special software that you need. Manufacturing's huge for this. They have software that's archaic because the systems that haven't been updated and all those things, because that's just the environment they come from, and it's okay. There has to be some additional hardening. But let's say you have Windows 7 machines. Those are going out of support in a couple of years. Probably start getting rid of those, right? If you have Windows XP, oh, I don't know what to say to you, but you probably need to really, really get rid of those as soon as possible. But you really should think about the hardware lifecycle management, because it will help reduce some risk. And then antivirus management, very important. You should have a good antivirus. You shouldn't just pick one out of the hat. You should actually do some research and figure out why the mechanisms are different from the other, because they are. There's really only a handful that I've done research on that I find that are deemable as good. There's a couple other ones that are excellent. So it depends on what you're buying and why you're using it. If it's cost reasons, that's fine. But imagine if you're breached, you're going to be spending more money later. And then security management. Security incident event tool, that's basically a SIM. A SIM is the one that does the device monitoring. It can actually review the types of data that's being exposed in your environment, or provide you a different information that cyber criminals are trying to get into your environment. So a good example, it's like a security system around your whole infrastructure. It can monitor everything and be proactive as well, and provide you exactly where the data is coming from and leaving to from a specific IP address. And then security education program, phishing evaluations, those go hand in hand, making sure that your employees, your staff understands the high-level concerns about security awareness, so knowing what to look for in phishing, knowing how to educate them to behave within a public environment using the Wi-Fi, all of that stuff is important. Physical security policies as well, so you need to know who's coming in and out of your business. I mean, I don't know how many breaches from the big organizations in the last 2 years that have been affected by third-party vendors plugging and playing stuff that is not supposed to be there. So making sure you have some form of physical security policy. And then, of course, policy and procedures managed regularly. Things change, they should change. You should keep them updated regularly. Typically, clients update these quarterly, some do monthly. Depends on what industry you're in. Financial institutions typically do them as they go, which means they're updating them probably on a weekly basis. And then ongoing security audits. You really need to reassess where you're at regularly. Security is not something easy to task within one moment. It's really an ongoing thing. Every time that there's a new different solution or vulnerability threat, your business has to kind of modify to that, to adjust, because I'll tell you this, the cyber criminals are adjusting to our defense. So what does that mean? We have to keep improving our defense. So with all of these things, it should help you have a little bit more defense against any type of data breach, and also give you the proper tools to report a data breach, especially because the GDPR response time is very limited. So to being able to adhere to that level, you really have to provide that information, and you have to have the tools to do so. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Galaxia. We've seen some questions come in. We're going to get to those right away, as soon as we can. We're almost done. Please keep submitting them in the chat box. We talked about your security program and in terms of a risk assessment, and we're going to do our next poll question here, which is basically, when were you last assessed for cybersecurity risk, and how was the maturity of your program rated? And if you haven't done that as of yet, you can just you can enter the last one, and we'd be happy to work on that with you. But again, it's just a way to think about, you know, where you are and where you need to be relative to GDPR and other privacy legislation that's out there, and just making your business operate effectively. Okay. Okay, I think we're good. I'm going to keep going as we're close to time here. You know, this is an area, you know, Glaxy had talked about this a little bit in terms of your ability to react. And, you know, incident response plans are something I don't see implemented or even existing in a lot of companies. And even the extent I see them, they're not typically consistently done. They're not always tested. So these are definitely some things you want to think about, because under the GDPR, if you have an event and a potential data exfiltration happened, you know, left your company, you have 72 hours to do that investigation, determine the impact, and notifying the appropriate governing bodies. And when all the process stuff Glaxy was talking about, probably all of a sudden, you know, adds a lot more value when you think you have to determine all this, figure it out, and produce a reliable report in finding in, like I said, in about 3 days. So I just think you want to think about, you know, is there funding aside to pay for this? You have a line of credit, or do you have a reserve? Who would be in charge? Crisis management is an area that's typically overlooked. Who is authorized to talk to the media, or can someone just ask your employees what they should say in the event of something like this? Have resource plans, have backups in case key people are not available. Again, you want to really recover quickly to maintain your business reputation, keep your service levels up with your clients. We talked about the 72-hour window. You want to test that plan periodically and identify your key learnings from that and continually make it better. And that leads us to our last poll question was, you know, do you have, when was your last incident response plan tested relative to a cybersecurity breach? And, you know, again, if you haven't done this or you need help doing one, we can definitely talk with you about that and help you get there. It's definitely something that takes a little thought, but it can definitely be accomplished. And so as we're going through this, so you likely have some questions, items to discuss about how you want to proceed. Again, we're happy to offer a complimentary follow-up consultation with you to discuss your needs and questions. And here's how to reach us if you don't have our contact information. We'll also be sending a follow-up email to all of you. And keep in mind, we also have the free trial of the phishing evaluation of the email phishing service that we have, and that's available to all of you. I know a number of you have signed up for it that showed interest. I did send follow-ups. We're just trying to get that all scheduled, so I'll be back in touch with those on relative to that. So we do have time for a couple of questions, and so I'm gonna go through those now. The first question is, I do see some risk in my business, but I have not started to assess my risk yet. Where is the best place to start? You know, well, so as we can see from the information we shared, the GDPR regulation can affect multiple parts of your business. And for our clients, we typically recommend reviewing your basic practices. As you recall, we're offering the complimentary phishing evaluation. That might be a good way to start, to just get some data about some of your risk and understand a little bit about how you could approach that. The next question, I don't sell on the internet or target companies in the European Union, so I don't see how this applies to me. Remember that GDPR is about protecting European Union members wherever they are and wherever their data is. It's not about selling to them only in their location. If you remember the example I shared where the employer has someone who's a dual citizen as an employee, if you don't follow this properly, the fines can be potentially devastating. Even to a small business, they can range up to $4 million based on the research we've done. I got time for two more. How do I ensure my business partners are GDPR compliant? It's true that, let me think through. It's true that your partner's lack of preparation can put you in jeopardy. That's definitely true. Typically, we engage with clients on this by first helping them identify and prioritize their partners relative to like a high, medium, and low risk rating. And then from there, we develop a plan together to address those risks. That would be my best reaction on that. And finally, this is an interesting one. I just received the GDPR compliance attestation letter from a client of mine. How should I respond to this? I think we're going to see a lot of these requests coming forward as fines begin to be handed down. U.S. companies and their clients and partners alike will be reviewing their supply chains more. Again, for this, we talked about third-party risk. It's critical that you understand how to reply to their inquiries. We'd be happy to discuss this in a little more detail with you to discuss what options might be most appropriate based on that situation in your business. So I know we're right about at time, and I wanted to thank you very much for your time and attention today. Hope you will find this to be a good investment of your time. And with that, the remaining questions that we did not get to, you will be followed up with individually, and we can work through discussing your best approach based on your situation. Thank you all again for your time and attention, and we wish you all a good day.